this webinar series is a series of 3 webinars on climate action. And this is our first webinar. We will be having 2 other webinars on consecutive weeks. Just to acknowledge as well that this webinar series is co-convened with our partners, the Global Water Partnership, UNICEF and WaterAid. We have a very interesting agenda lined up for you. Joao, if we can have please the next slide. I will be in this, well, before I go ahead, just to let you know that there is interpretation, and you can see on the bottom of your screens, you can see it says interpretation. We offer for this webinar a French translation. We are having in a couple of hours, as you may know, another session which will have translation to English and Portuguese, and that's more thinking about the colleagues that will be joining from the Americas. As I said, we have a very interesting agenda, a little bit packed, as you can see. I'm going to just make a very brief introduction to this webinar series, and then I will hand over to our colleague. We are very lucky to have with us John Matthews from ACTA, that will talk about the nationally determined contributions, and also will speak on some of the connections to climate financing. We have Anjali Johani joining from the Global Water Partnership, who will talk about the national adaptation plans. We have then 2 interesting case studies. Zambia case study, Joseph will talk, is the NAP manager, and will talk about the national adaptation plan process going on in Zambia. We also have colleagues joining from Fiji that will talk about the national adaptation plan and also the nationally determined, the Ndc in Fiji. And we have 2 discussions. We have Dauda joining from UNICEF West and Central Africa Regional Office, and we have Sarah King joining from the Stockholm Environmental Institute. Without further ado, Joao, please. I just wanted to situate a little bit this webinar today, and also the webinar series within the flow diagram that we have shared with our focal points in countries. And this is a process that we want to put in place and somehow start navigating in countries on climate action. As you can see, everything that we're suggesting starts with a little bit of a stakeholder mapping, and there was stakeholders reaching out to the climate stakeholders and other stakeholders in the country, just to see what are the opportunities to work together to influence the climate policies and to work together towards climate financing as well. You see in the flow diagram, we suggest a policy analysis where we understand better whether WAS is well integrated into climate policy, the national adaptation plans, and the nationally determined contributions that we will be talking today, and also whether climate is well reflected in the climate is reflected in the WAS strategies and plans. If that's not the case, what we suggest is the development of risk assessments, as you know, understanding better about hazards, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. That will obviously help identifying and appraising what are the best water sanitation and hygiene climate resilient solutions. Those obviously will need to be then financed, and we will need the funding to put those in place. And obviously at the end, what we want to see is that WAS is well reflected into climate policies and strategies, and the other way around. We want to see how climate resilience is well integrated into WAS policies, strategies, and plans. So just to say that in the next slide, Joao, you can just pass this quick here. So what we see is we have lined up these 3 webinars. In this webinar today, we are going to be focusing on policy analysis, and we are going to be talking about NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, the NAPs, the national adaptation plans, and we will see entry points on how WAS can feature better into this. We will discuss as well some of the challenges. Next week on webinar 2, we will go more about existing tools that you can consider to develop risk assessments for the water, sanitation, and hygiene sector. And also we will see, different framing was climate resilient solutions. And the third webinar, the last week of this month, we will be focusing on climate financing. So this is just for you to situate a little bit, to understand that there is this set of 3 webinars and where we're going to be focusing on, so that we help you understanding better this flow diagram that we have distributed among our country partners. And without further ado, we will just continue, and we have now John Matthews talking with us about NDCs, but also the links to climate financing. We're going to ask John to share your slides, if you can.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. John, thank you very much. Thanks again for joining, and welcome to you. You will be the first speaker opening this set of 3 webinars. Welcome, and thank you again, John.
I'm really grateful for you asking Jose and SWA more generally. My name is John Matthews. I'm with an NGO that's called AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. I've been working on water and climate issues since 2007 from an adaptation perspective, even longer from a scientific perspective. And I couldn't find a good picture that represented NDCs. It's often a very stressful process, so I decided to add just a picture of my son playing in some water as at least a happy starting note for us. NDCs are new. That's probably the most important point that we need to make, and that also means that because they're new, they're still being shaped. The first draft NDCs were issued as a special kind of practice version of NDCs in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, and we've tried to evolve them. They become live this year. As of today, around 90, maybe 95 countries have issued their formal NDCs. These are 5-year plans. They cover a number of kind of major topical areas. I'll come to that on the next slide. One of the things that's different than a NAP, and the talk after me will be on NAPs, is that every country has to make an NDC. In general, there are no police for NDCs, since that means that there's a huge amount of variation. I'm in the US. The US NDC, at least until Trump, included nothing on climate adaptation, for instance. The country of, I believe it's Trinidad, but it may be another country in the Caribbean. It also included nothing on climate adaptation. But most countries include both climate mitigation and climate adaptation. The larger goal of the NDCs in the Paris Agreement is that they're meant to talk about what each country contributes to a global process, and then they talk about their individual national needs and opportunities relating to climate change. There are a lot of bottlenecks in NDCs. I think the most important one for you as part of the WASH community is that the WASH is not well represented, and I would say generally water is not very well represented. just a quick overview of the topics that are usually included at a high level in NDC. Mitigation and adaptation are the main two, but again, the adaptation side is kind of optional. There may be references to finance and support. That's also not specific. I like to say that the biggest difference between an NDC and a NAP is that an NDC focuses on issues and priorities. It does not focus on projects. It's very unusual that an NDC will talk about a project. I suggest that you read your NDC, at least the draft NDC that's available for the country where you live or the countries where you're working on. Most of them are pretty short documents. They're not detailed. Some of them are just 4 or 5 pages long. Some of them, like Bangladesh, are over 100 pages because they go into a lot more specificity about the scope of work. So I think the central question that we want to resolve today with regard to NDCs is how do we connect NDCs and WASH? At the highest level, water is not a widespread priority in the NDCs. Maybe 80% of the NDCs, based on the best available data over the different generations of NDCs, just mention water. And they tend to talk about it in ways that, at least to water people like us, sometimes sound a little bit funny. They only talk about it maybe as a sector. Typically, they're talking about water utilities in that sense. Or they talk about water as a risk. So floods and droughts, tropical cyclones, things like that. Because of this, because this is the year that the NDCs go live, we can expect a lot of adjustments. In fact, for the last 6 years, NDCs have really just been living inside of environment ministries, and other kinds of ministries, health, finance, irrigation, and so on, have not really paid very much attention to NDCs, and that's a real challenge. It's also the opportunity that we have. That environment ministries don't know much about water in general. They certainly don't know much about WASH. And if we can take some of our policy connections, our policy assets, and begin to work with those environment ministries, especially because we're at the start of probably a new period that's generally referred to as NDC enhancement. How do we make the goals, the ambitions of the NDCs more aggressive and better? How can we improve them? And I would say that that's also part of trying to not just view NDCs from the perspective of a risk or a sector, but trying to see water as a resource that can enable really effective areas of strategic implementation of the NDCs. Maybe the last big point I want to make on this slide is when we think about WASH, how are we going to talk about WASH in the framework of an NDC? The first one is on the mitigation side. This is actually probably the easiest one, and it's maybe the least used. Can we talk about the carbon that is being used in WASH or that relates to WASH? So things like fecal sludge management, waste treatment, a lot of wastewater management. Those are really solid carbon and climate mitigation projects if we work on them in the right way. If we can integrate them with climate mitigation issues. Climate adaptation is mostly, I would say, about how do we avoid risk. So it's making sure that our WASH projects are durable, that they're credible, that they can last decades, even as we continue to face additional climate impacts. And as I'll talk a little bit more, that mostly means a lot about how we adjust. Actually, some of the points that Jose mentioned in some of his opening statement. How do we think about climate risk and really securing the kind of long-term needs of economic development around WASH? And so this is, I think, I understand that you all will be having a third session that's going to focus on climate finance. but I think it makes sense to talk a little bit about climate finance and NDCs, because I think this is where there's a huge amount of interest and potentially some confusion. Right now, climate finance is not connected to NDCs. Most financial institutions, and here I mean groups like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and so on, they ignore the NDCs. I have a close colleague in an MDB who told me, we completely avoid talking about them. And I said, what do you think about them? He said, they're awful. That's why. There's a lot of truth in what he says. But right now, it's a little bit quiet. It's almost secret. The MDBs are starting to weigh in. The World Bank is talking about working with dozens of countries to enhance their NDCs and try to make them better and improved. And they're especially focusing on water issues. The big gap here is in the term additionality. And that's, I'll get to that in a moment. Most of the climate finance that we see is coming from just a handful of institutions. It's the development banks, Adaptation Fund, and then the big multilateral development finance institutions like the GEF and the GCF. This is also very different than the NAPs. The NAPs I think of, because they're so project focused, they're basically shopping lists for donors. So a donor can look at them and say, here's what we want to work on. But for NDCs, it's issues. It's saying in this region of a country, we have flood issues or drought issues, or in this sector of the economy, we see mitigation and adaptation opportunities. What is additionality? This is a really unfortunate word. It's the bane of my existence. I do a lot of climate finance work. I hate the term, but we're sort of stuck with it right now. It's typically the only part of a project or a program that's actually funded for climate finance, especially when we're talking about loans. It literally is, we can think of a project as having kind of two versions, one in a world with climate change and one in a world without climate change. And the quantitative difference, the actual difference in money between those two projects, that is what the additionality is and what gets funded. And that also means right now that if you want climate finance, just as Jose has already been suggesting, you need to assess climate risk and think very hard about that funder's risk assessment methodology. Are you worried about this, and especially the connection between climate finance and the NDCs? Right now, I would focus probably more on the climate finance and less on the NDCs right now. The NDCs are moving quickly. They're probably, especially starting next year, they're going to see a lot of adjustment as people start to weigh in, other ministries start to pay attention. I think in practice, in the project side, my suggestion is for additionality, hire a hydrologist, hire an engineer, and they'll really be able to help you with that aspect of it. I'm going to skip this for now. Where are we headed right now? Climate finance is not a complete solution to climate funding gaps, and NDCs are weakly connected to climate finance. Most water projects, especially WASH projects, really need to have a strong kind of risk assessment, and maybe even more important, the term of art that I hear from places like the Green Climate Fund is they need to have a strong climate narrative. What is it that you are doing that relates to climate mitigation or relates to climate adaptation? And that's probably the strongest argument you can also make within the NDC, within these kind of broad categories. Our project should be counted against the NDC because it's contributing to one or the other category. And I think one of the real challenges, one of the gaps why we haven't seen WASH in the NDCs to date is that they have different definitions of resilience ultimately. especially in the adaptation side. And I think that they're not, the traditional definitions of resilience in both communities is hard to reconcile. I think that the transition is going to have to be from our side, from the water side, that we need to be able to make a stronger case for that climate story, that climate narrative in our own work. WASH really needs to be in the NDCs, and it's just not there right now, and that much. And the last point is probably the most important point. A climate resilience perspective will, in the end, make for a better WASH project. It's going to make it more durable. It's really about making sure that what we design and prepare for now is actually going to last, even as the climate keeps changing and it keeps evolving. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate the time to meet and engage with you. I hope you'll reach out to me at my email address here. Thank you so much, Jose.
Thank you so much to you, John. And I didn't share a little secret, is that John is really joining in the middle of the night for him. So we really appreciate the effort, John. You have made a very clear presentation that is really helping us to frame not only this webinar, but also see a little bit the bigger picture of what is coming as well. You have made great connections already between the NDCs, risk assessments, climate financing, which are exactly the things that we're going to be unfolding from this moment on. And as you have very rightly said, and now we have GWP making a presentation that is very complementary to what you have just explained to us, John. Now we will be focusing the conversation into the national adaptation plans. We have Anjali Lohani joining us from GWP, and also within the slide deck we have altogether the next point of this webinar, which will be case study number 1. We will have Joseph Mingini, who is the National Adaptation Plan Manager in Zambia. So Anjali, without further ado, the floor is yours. We have your slides, so we will pass your slides upon your request. Thank you, Anjali.
All right, thank you, Jose, and greetings to everybody. We'll shift gears now to the national adaptation plans. If you could go to the next slide. Yes, a short introduction. I'm a senior water and climate resilience specialist at the Global Water Partnership. Please move on to the next one. Yes. So we heard John say that countries are prioritizing water for adaptation, WASH not so much in them. But when we look at the NDCs, you know, the slide that I have up right now looks at the first set of NDCs, which countries shared in 2015. As John mentioned, these NDCs are revised every 5 years, and due to COVID, the first revision is occurring now in 2020 to 2021. So if you look at the first set of NDCs, we see that countries are indicating that they're facing key climate hazards via water. This is in figure 2 on the left. And then on figure 3, we see that when it comes to action, the priority areas of action when it comes to addressing climate impacts, particularly for adaptation, are also water related. You see water, agriculture, health, ecosystems, all of these are kind of water related areas and issues. They're water related priorities. This is the level at which the NDCs focus on. So if countries are prioritizing water for adaptation, what is happening on the action side? We see that there are actually major investment gaps when it comes to action on the ground on water and climate resilience. If we look at the NDCs, we see about 69% of countries have a portfolio of actions of water. And these can be quite sketchy, quite at a high level. They might be a list of projects related to water and water-related sectors, agriculture, energy, etc. Only 10% of them have detailed project proposals, which are necessary, as you know, to actually be undertaking action on the ground. Furthermore, 86% of countries are requesting international support for implementation of their NDCs. This support may be in terms of finance, in terms of technology development or capacity building. So we see a huge gap here. Many countries, majority of countries, up to 90% are prioritizing action on water, but only 10% of them have detailed project proposals, and 86% of them are asking for international support. On the graph on the bottom right side, it's looking at particularly percentage of countries that are requesting international support for implementation of the NDCs. You see 2/3 have a water portfolio, but a very small percentage of that have actual project details, which can be financed by the international community. Next slide. So the national adaptation planning process is an important process that is available to countries to close this water climate resilience investment gap. But again, on this side, there's insufficient progress. John mentioned, NDCs, they stay at the issues and the prioritization level. The national adaptation planning process, or the NAP process, goes a bit further, and countries use this to actually develop adaptation strategies, to develop programmatic approaches for implementing those strategies, and can go as far as identifying and developing projects and costing them, so that the implementation of these priority action areas takes place in the ground. Currently, out of 154 developing countries, only a fair bit, 125 have initiated the process to formulate and implement NAPs, but only 21 have submitted a NAP, and only 4 of these 21 are actually least developed countries in the world, out of 46 total LDCs. The global community has missed the 2020 deadline for all countries to have a NAP. So we're very far behind, and the NAP process needs to be accelerated. Next slide, please. So how does a country undertake a national adaptation planning process? The UNFCCC Secretariat, the least developed countries expert group, has developed a set of comprehensive technical guidelines that countries can, that can guide countries in undertaking the NAP process. You'll see I have just highlighted, yes, this guidance outlines 17 process that is categorized in 4 broad elements. The first one is laying the groundwork and addressing gaps. So gathering the political mandate, creating official mandate in country to be undertaking the NAP process, and undertaking a technical and political institutional stock taking. B, preparatory elements, doing a climate vulnerability analysis and identifying options to address climate risks. C is actually implementing the actions that have been identified, appraised, and deemed as valid in B. And then D, this is reporting and monitoring of the actions undertaken and feeding them into further preparatory elements. So this is a cyclical process, and countries are at different stages, can be at different stages of the NAP process, and can find different entry points across these 17 steps. Next slide, please. For this webinar in particular, what are the potential entry points for WASH in the NAP process? We see that, in element A, it's important for the WASH community to be aware of and engaged in the preliminary steps where a country is initiating and launching of the NAP process. Important for the WASH community to be aware and engaged here. Next, also in identifying in the stock taking and early preparation stage, assessing capacity gaps, assessing development needs, etc. There, the WASH community has an important role and important contributions to make. Element B will go into this a little bit further on the preparatory elements, and elements C and D as well, in actual implementation and reporting and monitoring. There, the WASH community has roles as well. If you can click next. We'll focus a bit on, on element B. So here there are, very relevant, this element for the WASH community to be participating in. For example, in assessing climate vulnerabilities, what climate impacts are particularly experienced when it comes to water and sanitation and health. And here, I'm just sharing with you a set of technical guidelines prepared by a partnership with UNICEF and the Global Water Partnership, which may be useful. This is on climate risk assessments for WASH in particular. And the next step, okay, identifying and appraising adaptation options. There too, we have technical guidelines that are prepared by UNICEF and GWP that can be useful for identification and appraisal. And then another important part of the NAP process when it comes to actually integrating climate change adaptation into sectoral planning, and when it comes to wider water sector planning, there the WASH community can have an active potential role, and technical guidelines also available on this front. Next slide, please. So to complement the UNFCCC's technical guidelines, which are cross-sectoral, and again, at a quite high level, the Global Water Partnership, in collaboration with the UNFCCC Secretariat and other water sector partners, has prepared a water supplement to accompany the UNFCCC technical guidelines. It's important to understand that it's not prescriptive. Again, countries will need to tailor the application of the NAP water supplement to their current context and their NAP baseline. But this resource showcases a lot of examples that can be useful to countries, and emphasizes the need for countries to be building on existing activities wherever they are in the national adaptation planning process, and sequencing these activities so that they can advance national adaptation planning in their own context. Next slide, please. Next. So just some briefly to go through the purposes of the water supplement. It is to enable the identification, prioritization, and financing of water-related adaptation strategies, and to do so in a way that integrates this into existing climate resilience and national development planning processes, which is important, so that climate planning is not happening in its, in a silo. It is to empower stakeholders involved in using and managing water to participate effectively, to include gender considerations in water-related adaptation planning, and importantly, to be helping non-water specialists, including climate specialists, to understand the issues related to water security in the context of climate change. Next. I'll present just some highlights that could be useful for the WASH community when it comes to national adaptation planning process. So in the NAP water supplement, you'll find outlined, say, these different layers. If you go through the different vertical layers, there are different decision-making layers in the NAP process. While the NAP process takes place at the highest political level, at the national level, there are national climate coordinating bodies, there are technical coordinating committees, and then there are the line ministries, as well as the subnational planning processes and the public, civil society, private sector, etc. So there's a potential flow diagram of the different decision-making processes at different levels, and the gray diagram, the gray boxes indicated here indicate entry points for water, and also relevant to WASH, the WASH sector professionals to be engaging in, depending upon your country context. So I invite you to look in detail in the NAP water supplement. Next slide, please. Here again, some on the technical highlight side of the supplement looks at the country context in terms of three broad systems: economic systems, rural livelihoods, and ecosystems. For WASH in particular, there is under economic systems relevance under municipal water and under rural livelihood settlement and supply. We look at different hydromet climate information systems, and then the application of those systems in the climate response and adaptation planning context. So important for as WASH planning takes place, then there could be different points of intersection when it comes to use of hydromet systems here in the NAP process. Next slide, please. A framework that the NAP water supplement takes is it really looks at the characteristics of resilience as the climate community speaks about resilience. So for in the WASH community, you know, let's run through an example like does a water supply system or a sanitation system have the preparedness to manage and cope with climate shocks, change and shocks? This is, you know, a framework for evaluation and for identification of potential adaptation options that you might want to put in place in your WASH planning. Does the WASH system have the diversity and redundancy? Does a water supply system have the redundancy to ensure continuation of functionality in the case of a climate hazard? You know, is there proper integration or connection among water supply systems, different types of water supply water sources to allow for optimization and benefits of scale in a climate change context where water supply may be scarce and more unpredictable, for example. Robustness, does the current water supply system have the potential to withstand change and shocks? So then it looks at these four characteristics to, you know, as the components of the adaptability of the water supply system, and then also further looking at transformability of the system to a better system. Next slide. I won't go into details on the next slide, but just to mention that the NAP water supplement looks at transbound. Next slide, please. Looks at the incremental value of transboundary coordination. So where waters are shared, and this is very common, river systems, groundwater systems, lake systems, there is that important transboundary coordination mechanism that needs to be in place for WASH systems to be resilient and WASH systems to be contributing to climate resilience. So you can take a look at the supplement for this as well. Next slide, it looks at financing water in the NAPs, both on the preparation of the NAP and then also on the implementation of the NAP. Importantly, the NAP water supplement can be useful to countries in accessing GCF readiness for water-related, you know, institutional and technical strengthening. GCF, meaning the Green Climate Fund. Next slide. Key messages using the NAP water supplement. You know, countries can be supported to embed, strengthen in-country capacity, make the economic case for water and WASH on climate adaptation practices, take a risk-based approach, communicating uncertainty. Uncertainty is not something we can eliminate, but we can communicate it and and plan properly based on the current in an uncertain context. Learning by doing, stakeholder ownership, including transboundary dimensions, balancing political, technical, and financial feasibilities, and undertaking financing. And on the financing note, on the next slide, I will invite our colleague, Joseph Mji from Zambia to provide an introduction of the NAP process that Zambia is undertaking. It's a combination of an overarching NAP and a second phase, which has a water NAP. And the Zambia team has used the NAP water supplement to be preparing this Zambia NAP proposal, which has now received financing from the Green Climate Fund. Next slide. And here I will post in the chat as well just the links to the NAP water supplement in English, Spanish, and French. Thanks very much. And over to you, Joseph.
Thank you, Anjali. Thanks very much for this comprehensive explanation on the NAPs and also the effort that you have made to clearly speak about the entry points for the WASH sector. I think you have shared very interesting guidelines, you know, the NAP general guidelines, but also specific tools that have been developed between GWP and UNICEF, which are sector guidance, right? And it's guidance that it's out there. I think also to take importance of the call that Anjali has made, that this process is very delayed, right? It's 2020 and only a few countries have gone through it. So it's also an opportunity, right, to get things right for the WASH sector. So we have learned a lot through your presentation, Anjali. Thank you very much to you and GWP as well. And now we are going to give the floor to the Zambia team, who is Joseph, who is the National Adaptation Plan Manager, is going to walk us through a few slides on this specific case study. And we will ask Joseph, please, to do this in a few minutes. We are running a little bit behind the schedule. So Joseph, if you are ready to share your slides, we will invite you to do that. I see Mamadou is also helping behind. Are you ready to present?
Good morning. Yes, I'm ready to present. So I want to share the screen.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to share the Zambian case on the NAP formulation process. My name is Joseph Mbinji, the manager for the National Adaptation Planning Project. Just to state that this project sits in the Department of Climate Change under the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources in Zambia, with the Global Water Partnership being a delivery partner. So in terms of background to the NAP process in Zambia, it actually started around 2014. At that time, there were efforts to do stock taking, to try and review relevant policies, strategies, and plans, as well as programs, relating to climate change and adaptation, and also to review climate change institutional arrangements and doing a stakeholder analysis to understand the different roles of key stakeholders. And then some of the efforts at that time were also went into stakeholder consultation to try and orient planners in government, ministries, and agencies on the need and the importance of the NAP process, and also reviewing Zambian climate change frameworks, which also helped to develop some kind of a NAP roadmap, and just to clearly define the roles of different stakeholders in the NAP process, especially for the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources, who's the focal point, and then Ministry of National Development Planning, as well as the Ministry of Water. And one other thing which was agreed in this stakeholder consultation was the need to mobilize resources for the NAP process. And Global Water Partnership supported the government of Zambia to access financing from the Green Climate Fund, which is supporting the NAP process through the readiness funds. So from 2014 to about 2017, there are quite a lot of things that happened in the around climate change issues in the country. One was the development of a national climate change response strategy in 2014, also the NDC in 2015, and the national climate change policy in 2016. But then nothing much could be done because of the gap in terms of resources. So last year, that's mid-2020, when the country or the government receives GCF support, the NAP process has been reactivated. And a couple of activities have hence started in terms of implementation. If I can go to the next. So if you look at what Anjali presented earlier, looking at the cycle for the NAP development process, there are 4 elements. So at the moment, as Zambia, we are in element A, because we are still trying to do the launch processes. We recently completed the stock taking exercise. And then we are at the moment trying to identify capacity gaps, but also trying to see how we can strengthen coordination mechanisms of climate change. So some of the milestones that we have, because this process goes on up to 2023. So March, let me just say April, we are doing the launch of the NAP process. And then by mid of this year, we expect to have, some of the work around challenges and gaps and in terms of institutional coordination, developed and strengthened. And then by December 2021, we hope to also have a system for integrating climate change adaptation into plans and budgets developed. And March 2022 adaptation action plan for sectors prioritized, developed, accompanied by some spatial regional plans developed. And then by mid-2022, we expect to have developed capacity for the implementation of the NAP. And then followed by development of a resource mobilization strategy, which we hope will achieve in the third quarter of 2022. And then the first quarter of 2023 will be concluding. By then we'll have a full national adaptation plan that will be launched in readiness for implementation. So in terms of institutional and policy alignment, I wanted to mention that the NAP process in Zambia is closely, or is actually anchored on the existing climate change institutional coordination mechanism. At the bottom there, we have multi-stakeholders or multi-sectors, which form a technical committee. There are about almost 30 or so members in that technical committee. So these people represent various sectors, including WASH is represented. And this technical committee, reports to the steering committee, which is chaired by a permanent secretary for national development planning. And this is composed mostly of permanent secretaries of various ministries. And this steering committee reports to a council of ministers up there, which is chaired by the vice president. So then on the other side, is also aligned with the SDGs as well as the National Development Plan. At the moment, we have a 7th National Development Plan, and we'll be moving into the 8th, the successor plan. And as a National Adaptation Plan, we are working closely with the National Development Planning Ministry to try and integrate climate change adaptation in the national development plan. So in terms of what this NAP process intends to contribute to the country's aspirations on climate change, up there is designed to contribute to the achievement of the Vision 2030, which is concerned about having a prosperous climate resilient and green economy. And how is this going to be achieved? This is by the NAP contributing to having national development policies, strategies and plans, programs, as well as national budgets, processes that are climate responsive, particularly adaptive to climate change, but also by accelerating implementation of climate change actions, improve or better coordination, as well as strengthen capacities and prioritize adaptation actions and resource in terms of fundraising to enable implementation. So this is a phased approach, as Anjali earlier mentioned. The first phase of the NAP process in Zambia is focused on having an overarching national adaptation framework. And then phase 2 is the one which will now focus more on water, that is post 2023. And in all this process, gender takes a center stage in all the key components of the NAP process, starting from coordination mechanism, having a system for integrating climate change adaptation to plans and budgets. When it comes to prioritization of adaptation actions, the capacity development, as well as financing strategies. So gender will take a center stage in all this. So water for the next phase is basically a focus, recognizing water as a connector to the key sectors like health, water, agriculture, and so on. Yeah. So in terms of some of the lessons learned so far in the process, The issue of ownership of the process by government is quite critical. As I've earlier mentioned, we are working very closely with national development planning, and this national adaptation plan has to anchor on these processes which government used to do medium to long term planning for the country as well as budgeting. Ministry of Lands, as I earlier mentioned, is the focal point and is the one which is doing the coordination of the NAP process. And Ministry of Water Development is quite closely involved in the process, especially that the second phase of the NAP will focus more on water. And then I also mentioned that the NAP process, is highly linked, is linked to the high-level national processes, the 7th National Development, and the successor plan, which is the 8th National Development Plan, which is coming up. So the NAP will help define how to integrate climate change adaptation and water security into the national development plans. And then the other lesson is also having a comprehensive NAP, which covers issues of climate resilience in the long term, also prioritization of adaptation actions, as well as financial strategies, issues of gender differences, and the private sector. The other lesson is to do with NAP coordination structures within the National Climate Change Coordination System, which already exists, and where there are multiple sectors participating, having different roles. Then lastly is collaboration between the government and Global Water Partnership, has really helped in terms of mobilizing resources to take the NAP process forward after it stalled for quite some time from 2014 to about 2020. Challenges at the moment is mainly around the impacts of COVID, as this has restricted the interaction of stakeholders. And so in conclusion, the NAP, Zambia NAP is expected to contribute to strengthen systems for integrating climate change adaptation to planning processes, and also help identify, prioritize adaptation actions with financing strategies, which will enable the country to systematically advance implementation of priority adaptation actions and contributing to the implementation of the NDC and the National Development Plan. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much to you, Joseph. That was very interesting, and it was also bringing light to the initial presentations. We have heard first about the theory of NDCs and NAPs, but you have helped us to bring the eyes into what is going on at the country level throughout your presentation, which is very much welcome and hopefully will inspire others. Just to bring to your attention that we have a very active chat and we welcome this interaction. We are hoping to have time for discussion at the end. Right now, we have the second case study with which is Fiji, and we have the speaker who is Philemon Ralo Gai Wow, who is Senior Climate Change Advisor at the Ministry of Economy in Fiji. I will ask Joao to bring us back to our slide deck so that we can...
I would like to ask the colleague from Zambia to please stop sharing the screen. So
Joseph, if you can please stop sharing so that we can take control again over the presentation. Thank you. Joseph. Joseph, I don't know if you can hear us. We would need you to stop sharing, please, the screen. Thank you. So that now Joao can have. I will ask our colleague in Fiji to please go over the slides as quick as possible, as we are running behind the schedule. And as I said, it's important for us to open also for discussion. So the floor is yours. Do we have Philemon on the ready to speak?
Yes, hello, John. Will you be sharing my presentation? Do you have it with you?
Yeah, we have it already on the screen. Joao, maybe we can pass into the next slide, please. Thank you, Philemon. Just appreciate if you can spend a few minutes. As I said, we are a little bit behind the schedule. Thank you.
Okay. I can't see the presentation on my screen.
We have the first slide on the screen. Philemon, can you not see it?
Yeah.
Philemon, we cannot hear you now. I don't know if we see your slide.
Mr. Philemon is on
No,
mute.
thank you. I'll go.
I think we're having some issues with the internet connection. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Philemon, can you try now?
Yeah, I can see it now. May I begin?
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, so hello, Philemon here from Fiji. Yes, as mentioned, I work at the Climate Change International Cooperation Division for our government. We are the policy arm in regard.
I'm sorry, Philemon, we are losing you, and I guess this might be the internet connection. We cannot hear you now.
Sorry about that, facing some technical issues here.
We hear you now.
Okay, so our National Adaptation Plan was launched in 2018 during the COP24 in Poland. As some of you may know, Fiji had co-chaired the COP23, which was held in Bonn, Germany. And so our National Adaptation Plan has 160 measures, which has been sought out to be prioritized over a 5-year period. And the actions are split into 2 components, which is into systems and sectorial components. Time frame, the consultation period took about 14 months, and this involved consultations with government stakeholders, the various ministries that would be involved in the direct implementation of our National Adaptation Plan. The 160 adaptation measures identified as urgent by the stakeholders. So these were the most urgent issues that we needed to be measured upon. So it came up to 160, which will be prioritized over 5 years. Some of the milestones which I may like to share is that, yes, we had successfully launched it, and we are now in our 3rd year of implementation. And by the 5th year, we will conduct another stock take, and then we will align ourselves with an updated implementation plan and how we can better that. The Ministry of Economy, through us, the Climate Change Division, yes, we implement this, the NEP policy, and we try and align it to the different ministries with their policies and their action plans, and also to the greater national development plans and strategic plans. And also when we're looking at adaptation-related investments, they have to be aligned to our National Adaptation Plan. Next slide, please. So how is WASH reflected in our National Adaptation Plan? The relevant government entity that is aligned or associated with WASH were part of the consultation or deliberation process leading up to the formulation of our NAP. And the relevant ministries are the Ministry of Infrastructure and Waterways and Environment, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Women and Social Welfare were present. during these consultations, and they had also given their inputs of how their work can be reflected in our National Adaptation Plan. So our National Adaptation Plan has 5 sectorials, and this is the ones that are listed there. Human settlement, food and nutrition, biodiversity, and natural environment, infrastructure, and health. So all these 5 components of our 5 sectorials complement each other, and which reflects to the WASH services. Our NAP endeavors to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. And we are trying to achieve this through the infrastructure section and the subsection water and sanitation. The implementation of NAP is expected to benefit for achieving universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water and adequate equitable sanitation and hygiene. This is something very important for us when we're looking at adaptation for climate change, where communities have to be relocated due to sudden storm set events and also slow set events so when we're looking at relocating communities, this is a very important aspect that we also have to consider in terms of adaptation. Next slide, please. So the background on our NDC. So Fiji was the first country to ratify the Paris Agreement. And some of you may know, after you ratify, you are required to submit your intended NDCs, which Fiji had done in 2015. In 2020, we updated our NDCs and reaffirmed our targets of a 30% reduction. And this we plan to take into account through 100% renewable energy electrification generation. So far, we are at 86% of renewable energy generation through direct connection to our grid. And additionally, we are trying to foster reduction in the demand side of the energy efficiency through our transport on land and also in maritime. These are some of the main targets that we have in terms of our NDCs. And additionally, a commitment to achieve zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, upfront information to facilitate clarity, transparency, and understanding of Fiji's decarbonization ambitions, and the commitment to enact our climate change bill. And also the commitment to operationalize our National Adaptation Plan. This has also been included in our NDCs. So some of you may know not much about Fiji, but we have a population of 900,000. And our carbon emissions are not as substantial as other developed countries, but we are taking a stand in trying to do our side of things in reducing our carbon emissions at a domestic level. Next slide, please. So how is WASH reflected in the NDCs and Fiji's 2050 low emissions development strategy? And so we have an NDC implementation roadmap. The roadmap is to provide a temporal pathway for the implementation of the mitigation actions to achieve the transformation for Fiji's NDCs. So this is something more on a short term, how we can achieve our NDCs through the identified mitigation actions. And this mainly focuses on the energy generation of waterways and treatment plants. The Fiji Low Emission Development Strategy, which is led this long-term strategy to attain net zero emissions by 2050. This has an economy-wide approach and demonstrates a broad linkage and synergy between the adaptation and mitigation planning processes. LEDs will be used as a tool to enhance our future NDCs. And this includes, of course, infrastructure, waste, and sanitation. So, as you may know, from from our side, the WASH aspect of it is quite integral, not just for adaptation, but also in the mitigation side of climate change policy level. Next slide, please. So this is just my last slide, and this is our NDC Investment Plan and project pipelines. This is something that is for our donor, and when we look for climate financing. And the reason I put it here because of as you can see in E8 and E12, where we have an efficient operation and maintenance of water supply systems and efficient operation and the maintenance of wastewater treatment systems. And this is an important aspect of climate adaptation as well, when we're facing issues of with communities that are at a risk of adverse weather conditions, and we need to factor in these considerations and how we can gain donor support to assist us in our efforts. And lastly, just to reiterate on an earlier point, we are now in the phase of finalizing our climate change bill, which basically sets a foundation for all the climate change related policies that we have established over a 12-year period. And we hope this will further our work in climate change. I believe this is my last slide, and thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Thank you to you, Philemon. This was a really interesting presentation, and I see, participants of this webinar are receiving this reality check, after presenting NDCs and NAPs. We have heard about Zambia's ongoing development of and formulation of National Adaptation Plan, but your presentation, Philemon, also brought us into a country that is as advanced as Fiji is already, with what we consider from the WAS community a good national adaptation plan with very good references to human rights, to water and sanitation, and other aspects that you have been able to capture very well in your national adaptation plan. And you have also refreshed us on developments of the nationally determined contributions. So thank you very much. We really appreciate that. And
thank you, Jose. Just the last thing I forgot to mention. We have also a costing methodology for our NAP, and now we are in the phase of training our government relevant officers on the skill set of costing adaptation actions in the various ministries. Thank you very much again.
Thank you back to you, and we really appreciate that. Also to recognize that it's late in Fiji, so thanks for staying this late with us. So the next part before we jump into questions, and again, I encourage you to continue interacting in the chat. We see a lot of interaction, and it's very nice to see. It's important for us that you are able to express what you think, and we will open microphones at the end, but please go ahead and continue exchanging in the chat box. Now we have, we're also lucky to have Dauda joining from the UNICEF West and Central Africa Regional Office. And we have invited Dauda to reflect a little bit, obviously on everything that we have heard, but also on how UNICEF is moving ahead with trying to influence, national adaptation plans and NDCs, and to try to have WAS reflected there. We open the floor to you, Dauda. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jose. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well.
Can you see me at all?
We can see you. We can see you.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. I think the first thing I'd like to say is really to thank SWA for organizing this series of webinars. We're very sort of happy to co-convene these with GWP and WaterAid. And I think the first thing I'd like to say is that, as an organization that is working in over 100 countries in WASH, this sort of aspect of, partnership is actually quite crucial to making anything happen on response to climate change. This is I think one of the sort of lessons that we're learning, that we have to work very closely with others. The issue of strategic positioning of WASH, within sort of climate policy, is very critical, and it's a message that we're sort of trying to get through to all our colleagues all over the world. We agree, of course, that the sector is not well positioned in the NDCs, and it's also not adequately reflected, in many of the NAPs. And it's concerning, especially as we see a sort of shift, towards towards green funding of various types. So I think this is becoming more and more important. Now, in the case of the NDCs, as has been mentioned by, I think, 2 or 3 speakers, climate policy at country level can be very complicated, and UNICEF is not always well positioned, to become, actively involved in the process. And I think this is, so one of the other key messages is that I think there's a need for more creativity in terms of institutional positioning, within countries. A good entry point is very often, working closely with the NDAs, the national designated authorities, and we have the capacity to sort of influence, thinking at the NDA level, through our technical, support in terms of studies and so on. In relation to the NAPs, we are involved in many countries, as one of the stakeholders, and sometimes facilitating stakeholder consultations in a few cases. But it's very sort of, random. It's very patchy. It's not very consistent. So that's something that we need to work on. Again, it's this issue of institutionally positioning ourselves better, across the the various institutional aisles, water, environment, and so on. Now, I think that the NAPs are immediately very critical to our mission for children. This is where we can tackle, in a very real way, the sort of interface between access to WASH services on the one hand, and the impacts of climate change, on sort of vulnerable, populations, which include, of course, children who are the most vulnerable. I think Anjali from the Global Water Partnership mentioned and described some of the tools that the sector has. And I think this positions us very well, to support, the formulation of maps, in country. The methodology is becoming better known. I think I should add actually that these are not GWP tools or UNICEF tools. These are sector tools. I think they're available for everybody. And I would encourage, us to sort of make that point very clear, and to sort of popularize the tools and make sure that they're sort of much more accessible and usable. So I think just to, and then looking at the examples, the 2 excellent examples, I'd say actually the Zambia sort of NAP experience, and particularly this idea of a thematic water NAP, I think shows what can be done. So I think that's one of the very interesting things that I've learned today, and I think it just shows everybody what one can do. Now, our work with the Green Climate Fund gives a further indication of the importance of the dual problem, first of all, of building in sort of climate resilience, into WASH policy. That's a fairly straightforward issue for the sector, but I think the more difficult problem is the reverse issue, which is that of ensuring that WASH is included in national priority, and which is what this this particular webinar is about. So I think that is the challenging issue, and I think the key thing for us is this sort of institutional, creativity about institutional linkages at country level. So to conclude, I'd probably say that we're quite well positioned as a sector for implementation. We have the tools. Those are being developed and strengthened and popularized. Where I think the weakness lies is in terms of our strategic positioning, within the sort of climate landscape, if I may put it that way. And as long as that remains the case, the keys to to climate finance will remain, out of the sector's hands. So I think just to reinforce the key message is that we really need to work very hard on this. So I'll keep it short. I'll keep it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dada. That was really interesting. Also hearing from your perspective, knowing that you have such a big country presence and that you are trying to move this agenda, as you said, with sector tools that are available and with your own experience. And it's great that you can share this with all the participants. Thank you very much, Dada. Our next discussion is Sarah Dikin. She is joining from the Stockholm Environmental Institute from SEI. Sarah has been part of some interesting research and analysis on the linkages between NDCs and WAS. So we are really happy to hear your reflections, Sarah, on this, and also anything that you would like to talk about what you have heard during this webinar. Thank you, Sarah. Just a few minutes, and then we will then jump into the Q&A. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks very much for this invitation to share my perspective. It has been really interesting, the presentation so far. So I'm just going to make just some brief comments on three main issues that I see. And I'm going to focus on sanitation because I think that we often focus more on water when it comes to the climate side, and sanitation has been a little bit overlooked. So I'm going to talk about the NDCs and climate action more broadly. So we've heard a bit how mitigation adaptation, some challenges in addressing those in the WASH sector. And I want to talk about this on the policy level more from a global perspective, looking at the NDCs. We've already heard about those and how they define what countries are doing at a national level to reduce emissions, as well as some other activities like adaptation. So like Jose mentioned, we've been doing some research on this, looking at the policy side, and I just want to quickly highlight some of those findings. We used SEI's NDC SDG connections tool, which breaks down the NDCs into specific activities and links them to the SDGs. And we did this looking at SDG 6, and we found about 10% of these NDC activities, which are more concrete, they're not just references, they're more concrete activities. We found about 10% of these activities were related to SDG 6, but then when you break it down and look at sanitation, of this 10%, taking that portion, only 2% were related to, of these NDC activities were related to sanitation, and 3% were related to wastewater. And actually, a majority of these were adaptation as opposed to mitigation, even though we know that the sanitation sector and the wastewater sector makes significant contributions to emissions, both directly and indirectly. And we looked at this also by location. We found, for example, that it was mostly lower middle income countries who had these sanitation related NDC activities. There was almost nothing included from high income countries. And most of these were countries in the MENA or the sub-Saharan African region. And this might be due to water scarcity or experiences with water reuse in those areas. But importantly, we didn't see any mitigation activities from some of the countries that are producing largest emissions from wastewater systems, countries like the US, Indonesia, China, India. So we can see that there is quite limited inclusion in the NDCs of sanitation, and this is important, and it shows a lack of understanding of the linkages between sanitation and climate change. And another gap I wanted to highlight is on the climate finance side. So we also looked at projects that had been approved by the Green Climate Fund, to see how sanitation again was included. And we found only a handful of projects which had sanitation components. And actually for these components, they were often co-financed. So the funding was not actually coming from the Green Climate Fund, it was just a component co-financed. So we see maybe that either countries don't see the linkages, they don't have maybe context-specific evidence on these issues to prepare a climate finance application, or perhaps climate finance organizations themselves don't really appreciate sanitation and the climate linkages there. And so the last point I want to make is just on the importance of thinking holistically. So we've heard about this concept of additionality earlier. And from my side, I think we need to think a bit more holistically than specific add-ons. So there has been a focus in the WASH sector a little bit on climate proofing and what we can add on from the technological side. But we also need to remember that a lack of essential services, of water, sanitation, actually contributes significantly to climate vulnerability itself. We can think about how warming temperatures will increase diarrhea prevalence, and also that with extreme events, those with poorer services will be disproportionately affected. So I just wanted to highlight the importance of thinking holistically about adaptation and not just coming at it from the technical add-on side. So I think in the interest of time, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really, really interesting. And thanks for also boosting a little bit this conversation on sanitation. As you said, in many cases is forgotten. And from the WASH sector, obviously, the sanitation, the S of the WASH acronym is an important one. We know, as you have reminded us, and through your very consistent analysis, you know, how we lack those references. There are tools that have helped you see these gaps, and it's good that we talk about it, right? Because as we are discussing in this webinar, all these we are discussing today on climate policies and strategies, and the need to have what's well reflected, because otherwise we are already discussing along this webinar how otherwise climate financing is not flowing to the WASH sector and to sanitation particularly, which is very much is lagging behind us. Again, you have reminded us. Thanks, Sarah. That was very, very interesting, and thanks for your contribution to this webinar. Again, back to our chat. It's been very animated. We have seen interesting discussions on issues that relate to data availability, issues that relate to data gaps. Again, making the link quickly to what it's been suggested here, right? How to strengthen the links between WASH development and a climate rationale, what the impacts, how the WASH sector is being impacted by climate change. This is what we need to be able to articulate. That's essential if we want to have WASH reflected in national climate policy. We've been reminded all over this presentation and this webinar how there are tools. Some of them have been presented, other ones have been also highlighted in the chat. So the WASH sector has actually tools that can be used, you know, to try to be part of the formulation of the national adaptation plans, the implementation, and also to come up with a strong rationale as to why WASH needs to feature into the NDCs. John has started the presentation reminding us the scope of the NDCs. We have learned how those are, the scope of the NDCs is not about projects. John Matthews has strongly told us about that. We've seen how the national adaptation plans obviously are focused on adaptation rather than on mitigation, but there is a big opportunity to go much more into depth. We have seen how countries are developing sectoral national adaptation plans. This is being highlighted by the Zambia presentation, who on the second phase is going to actually devote the energies to develop a water national adaptation plan. Dauda from UNICEF has also reminded us on how, you know, there are opportunities to work in this direction, and perhaps this example can be taken forward, and other countries can follow this example of trying to develop national adaptation plans, focusing on water. The Fiji presentation was also very illustrative because the NAP has been already formulated there. And there are even questions, you know. Philemon has referred to this costing tool, and this has there is a lot of interest in the chat box, and to see whether that can be further shared for other countries and partners to learn from that. There are questions also coming perhaps to you, Philemon, in terms of how is the mitigation angle being measured. You have already said that perhaps Fiji is obviously not one of the big contributors, but you are doing as much as you can and leading with the example as well. And then, yeah, we got this final presentation by Sarah, reminded us that sanitation is a key component and that we cannot forget about it. Again, and we have seen also references in the chat box about utilities. We're talking about rural WAS, but we're also talking about larger infrastructure, so infrastructure of different sizes. We've seen about climate-proofing infrastructure and services, but also the resilience that the WAS services bring at the community level, and how the sector, the WAS sector, and the WAS programs contribute to build and increase community resilience. And again, we've seen all over the links to climate financing and climate rational. I don't know if with this couple of minutes, perhaps I've seen that John, you've been very, very active. I don't know if you would like to make some remarks about the exchanges. If you want, we can open the microphone for you. John, sorry that I spoke to you now in the middle of the night for you, but yes, as you've been so interested, and you can just open the microphone any moment, John, if you feel. Yes, I see you. Do you want to share summarize a little bit your exchanges on the chat box?
Sure. I haven't put on my pajamas quite yet, Jose.
Thanks. Just in 2 minutes. Just sorry to put you on the spotlight again, but you've been very active. If you would like to just share a couple of concluding comments before we close in 1 or 2 minutes. Sure. There were some really good comments that were made here. One of them came from Katarina about this difference that I mentioned between the definitions of how the climate community sees resilience and how the WASH community sees resilience. And I'm not saying that either one is right or wrong. It's really irrelevant in many ways for the NDCs in general and for climate finance in particular. And I think this is also true for the NAPs. If you want to engage in the climate world, then you really need to use the climate change community's vision of resilience. And that really is talking about climate impacts and how you respond to them. It's an A-B process. It's the cost of doing business in that world. And maybe the most interesting way to talk about it, just to elaborate a bit, is that I see a new terminology just in the past year that started to emerge. It's a bit uneven, but I think it's useful, and I suspect it's going to take hold quite strongly. And it's the difference between climate proofing and adaptation projects. Climate proofing projects is taking a traditional development project and then making sure that it goes through some type of a stress test and risk assessment to make sure that it will keep working under emerging climate conditions, especially ones that maybe we haven't experienced yet. So its main purpose is still focused on maybe what that project, how it would have been conceived 10 or 20 or 50 years ago. Adaptation projects are a little bit different. Adaptation projects are going to be the ones that really focus on how we that their main purpose is for addressing climate impacts and a really good point, also climate opportunities, potentially good things that may be happening from climate change in some places. So that may be really make kind of addressing, especially at the kind of strategic level that you see in NDCs, like some of the really big kind of emerging issues that are happening from climate change.
Is that a fair response, Jose?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for helping us conclude this webinar. I really thank you, and all the speakers. I think it's been very interesting session. We're going to close now, but I'd like to remind you that the recording of this webinar in English and in French will be available on the Sanitation and Water for Partnership website. You will find this. Later on, we're having another session of the same webinar, more oriented for Spanish and Portuguese speaking. And obviously, we already invite you to the second and third webinar the next week and the week after, where we will be covering the other topics. So looking forward to having you again for a very interesting session next week. Thank you all for participating and actively contributing to the chat discussion. Thank you very much. And bye for now.